Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Master Senders today. One of the things that we've talked about a lot off the air is how prescient the religious right was. And what we see, especially with the split in the sort of skeptic rationalist community, beginning with Elevator Gate and Atheism Plus, and then culminating in the rise of the SJWs, where even people like Peter Boghossian admit that they made a mistake and that they don't really want to fight Christians anymore, but the SJWs. And Dawkins a couple years ago admitted that the New Atheist Project essentially failed because most people probably can't be good without the belief and fear of God. So one of the things that's happened, though, now as they're sounding the alarms for the SJWs, for the RadFems, for all of these groups, the civil libertarians, the libertarians, the fedoras, the skeptics, they were all on the same side with the SJWs 30 years ago. They were on the same side. And they can't be allowed to forget that, because they had this 10-year autism war with Ken Ham, which did pretty much nothing. I mean, Ken Ham is still around, and the SJWs are taking over. So, sort of setting the frame, do you have anything to say for that?
Well, I think anybody who was on the internet during the mid-2000s is quite aware of these really, frankly, stupid debates that would go on between skeptics and those that were considered, fundamentalists or creationists. And in many ways, those that did engage in a lot of these debates were low-hanging fruit. Many of them were just pastors, or they were laymen, not particularly well-versed in any of the arguments. And because they typically could not defend them on the best of days, it was sort of the stereotype of the atheist being, would win these quote-unquote debates, even though they were, for lack of a better term, were actually tard fights when it came to the intellectual prowess of both of them. But when it comes to the broader issue, is that they did have the atheists did have quite a bit of their heyday in the 2000s, in large part because of the Iraq War, which damaged the reputations of both George W. Bush and Tony Blair. And many saw this as the opening to discredit religion. So the only reason why the United States got involved in a pointless war, or the only reason why Iraq was not a full functioning liberal democracy after the toppling of Saddam, was obviously because of religion. And so that's why you had people like Hitchens and Harris and Dawkins and Dennett and others not only argue that religion was in itself bad, that religion was not only inadequate, in itself it was bad. It was the real problem. Now, more or less, they seem to have succeeded in pushing out Christianity from the public sphere in a number of different areas. But by the early 2010s, you really began to see a fissure within the broader movement of the atheists, with things such as Elevator Gate, and then compounded by Gamergate, where it just evolved into a civil war between those that preferred, for lack of a better term, more degenerate and fan servicey art in their media consumption, and the other that was just more influenced by progressive ideas such as feminism, gay liberation, etc. And so, in many ways, the mid to late 2010s was basically one large civil war between the two. And what's funny, as you noted, is that when the SJWs have come to full flower and are now arguably far more influential in culture, when it comes to how corporations advertise, what media is created by people like Disney and others, they're beginning to see that, at the very least, that progressivism in many ways has been worse than any authoritarian tendencies they claim the Christian right to have. But it's not only that, the Christian right and many of their predictions as to what would happen when Christianity was pushed out of the public sphere in American life have come true. And we'll discuss a lot of those issues throughout the podcast today.
Exactly. So the sort of fedora secularist narrative was, first of all, the idea of the increasing secularization of the world, which is essentially totally discredited. No social scientist really takes that seriously anymore. And this idea that Europe would become or the West more secularized, one, and then two, that would be good, arguably didn't happen, because a lot of these new atheist types call SJWism a new religion. Exactly. Because no religion doesn't mean no religion. The very premise that there would be this vacuum in the public space for moral authority, for legitimacy, for understanding where we fit in the world, and that, just science with Carl Sagan could fill that void, was just laughable on the face of it. And the religious right predicted that if and when Christianity was removed from the centerpiece of the public square, it would be replaced by socialism and Marxism. And they even called where it would come from. It would come from the universities. People like Bill Lind, who's also famous for his fourth generation warfare work, was at the time a friend of Paul Weyrich, one of the founders of the religious right. And he predicted that the universities would bring out these Marxist ideologues to just take over society. And at the time, nobody really paid much attention to Lind other than his military theories. But his work on the religious right pretty much pointed exactly where we are now. And this was like 30 years ago. He called universities then Ivy covered North Koreas. And this was at the same time that the fedoras were fagging on about university science. The university was the new church. They were right. The university was the new church, but what the university produced were Marxists.
Exactly, and the thing is with the Marxists in university, that's not a relatively new thing. As you said, those that were more aware of trends within academia knew that this thing was already happening. In fact, that these Marxist professors were entrenched in many of these universities since the 60s. Somebody I knew that was in university in the 1980s at a state school remembered finding or hearing one of his professors whistling the International. Again, this is back in the 80s. So the thing is, these things were always there. And they were always these undercurrents of Marxist thought and later postmodern thought were prevalent in universities for a long time, and it's only now that they're becoming far more visible, and that's why it's kind of, I don't know. You can tell that many of these people that fetishize science, like scientism, and fetishize the university as being this place for moral and intellectual discussion, obviously have not been either beyond in the university long enough past the graduate level, or even paid attention at the graduate level. These things are already there, and they were there for a long time. It's only until recently that they come out. And really, if not to get too far afield or get too ahead of ourselves, but you really don't get to see the attention by the skeptics toward the problems of Marxism in the university until feminism became front and center, especially with concerns with rape culture and issues of consent. And so it's more like while these skeptics are finally just realizing it, somebody who's been on the Christian right for a long time, and many others who have been on the Christian right, I think the question is like, where have you been?
Yeah, exactly. Where have you been? And the other thing that these like I said, fedoras, social libertarians, and or the one that was popular a while ago, cultural libertarian. Those people, the thing for them was, well, look, we just have free speech. Just we're gonna have free speech. The university is the center of free speech, and we're just going to, fight the censorship of the religious right. And then, of course, cancel culture comes out with the SJWs to then cancel them. And again, taking that long look in the mirror, they were the first SJWs. The new atheists, the fedoras, were the first SJWs, because I've heard accounts of Christians who were in the STEM fields who tried to have their careers ruined by fedora professors or fedora colleagues So going back to the 80s, they were trying to root out Christians from the university by canceling them. And so cancel culture itself begins with the new atheists, and now they're just butthurt it's being used against them.
Exactly, because if you go back to the new atheists, it's not that they were saying that atheism should have a voice at the table. It's or to say that perhaps religion is not entirely as good as it. I mean, the way that people such as Dawkins and Dennett and Harris and Hitchens would argue is that religion in and of itself was bad, and if something is inherently bad by its very nature, that justifies pushing them out of the public sphere, that justifies shaming them publicly, that justifies mocking them, and in a sense, to use modern parlance, canceling them. And so the thing is, what are the SJWs doing to the skeptics at the moment? Well, they're labeling them as being inherently bad, not worthy of having a discussion with, and that these people are worthy of being canceled for that reason. So the thing is, this idea that in reality that the skeptics are always for free speech, we're always for an equal seat at the table for everybody, regardless of their beliefs. Like, that's not really borne out in history, and that wasn't borne out at their apex all the way up until the 2000s. The only way that they are really feeling the heat at this point is simply because, again, the tables have been turned on them.
Exactly. And this idea that the new atheists pushed that Christians in the academy would lead to quote unquote anti-scientific positions. I mean, spoiler alert, Yale University was founded by Christians in the 18th century. The first universities in Europe were founded by Christians. The idea that Christianity would lead to the death of the university rather than secularism is just patently absurd. And we're seeing it now. Coming out of the universities, we have concepts like reason, logic, and evidence are white supremacist concepts. STEM fields are white supremacists, and we just need to deconstruct all of it. Now, I guarantee you that was never going to happen if the religious right had taken over the universities. Not that they were ever close to doing so in the first place.
Well, exactly. And even further, just to kind of defend my field, you had schools such as George Washington University fairly recently in their history graduate program, in large part because nobody was attending or nobody was interested in these history programs. And because these history programs have become like hotbeds of ideology, and many of whom, of course, various forms of Marxism, it's taken a lot of the interest outside of history to the point where nobody wants to take it. It's just so boring. You're spending hours talking about people's feelings and trying to apply some level of dialectic to some obscure group in the, let's say, the 1950s on the other side of the world, and how that was shaped by the patriarchy, or something like that. In many ways, like, the Marxists have killed academia and are in the process of killing academia, if academia had ever had a purpose of learning and challenging ideas. And again, so I think the biggest problem with the new atheists was their initial faith in academia and in science to produce something that was worth emulating for a societal model. And in reality, even at the time when they were fetishizing universities, Marxism was already there. And I think that's probably a bigger point with a lot of the skeptics, with a couple of exceptions. Most of the skeptics really don't exhibit a Dunning-Kruger effect when it comes to a lot of the things that they claim to hold dear. And most of the time, they feel the need to pontificate on subjects they absolutely know nothing about. For example, a lot of the internet fedora tippers were experts in science because that they could defeat, a country pastor online in an Facebook debate, or they could, or even some of the more credentialed skeptics, people like Dawkins, people like, let's see, his name escapes me, Tyson.
Hitchens.
Well, Hitchens, but also like with Tyson, which, their work is because that they've had some work in science, they feel like that they know everything about politics and society and religion. I mean, and really, there's just something that with this new atheism mindset that has contributed to the Dunning-Kruger effect that plagues most of our universities today.
Well, and it's interesting, right? A real evolutionary biologist, E.O. Wilson, has a somewhat positive view of religion, as adaptive to human populations. Something Dawkins would never admit. Well, he admits now, I guess. But you would also mention that some of the actual rhetoric and tactics of the SJWs today are literally lifted verbatim from the Fedora's rhetoric against the religious right. You want to get into that a little bit?
Well, as I alluded to before, what distinguished the new atheism from traditional strains of atheism was not just the idea that religion is factually incorrect in the general about the supernatural, the existence of God, etc. They went one step further and argued that religion in and of itself was immoral. You had people like Dawkins and Hitchens were trying to dissect, Hitchens known for his iconoclastic efforts to tear down Mother Teresa's image, or you have Dawkins in his works taking verses from the Old Testament and arguing that the God of the Bible was cruel and vindictive. And so they tried to use this to sort of justify their narrative that religion was the cancer itself. It wasn't just merely mistaken. It was something that was inherently immoral and needed to be done away with. And that's why some people refer to the new atheists as anti-theists as opposed to just simply being atheists. But, in reality, many of those same ideas when it comes to banishing from the public place, like religion, like how many times have you heard this from the skeptics or from the atheists, is that, religion and personal belief have no place in the common, in common discourse. Right, that's something that's incredibly private, and so that was usually shamed or used to shame those who were religious or those who openly talked about the religion in places like politics, academia, etc. They try to, many ways, banish it to the bedroom, so to speak. But in reality, what has also happened is that the SJWs have adopted similar tactics. Well, because they came from the same cloth. Right, the SJWs attempted to do the same thing, are now doing the same thing to people who were previously considered skeptics, and now they're feeling the heat for it. And going back to what you were saying about religion, you have some atheists that actually acknowledge the positive benefits of religion. Jordan Peterson has actually done quite a bit in bringing a lot of skeptics to that conclusion, because while he's a bit of an agnostic or atheist himself, I'm not quite sure where he is. He's not quite a theist, but he recognizes that religion is essential in many ways to living a moral life and for the good of society and individual development. And so even then, the new atheists' thesis is not even believed by many atheists anymore.
Well, and what's interesting too is the tactics of the new atheists was assuming that they were just preaching to the choir, that they represented the mass opinion of society, and that they could just point out how Christianity differed from that. Well, it turns out that they did not represent the vast majority of society, or even those most influential elements of society, because now they've turned against them. Now, there was another element of the religious right that was about the expression of violence in media. There was concern about film, music, television. I think it was in the 1980s when PG-13 and rated R started really coming out as a genre of film. And I think when Red Dawn came out, it was had the most on-screen deaths of any film up to that point. And there was this concern that, well, you have violence in media, it's going to lead to violence in real life. And everybody in the 80s and the 90s, or in the early 2000s were saying that's crazy, that's stupid. But what do we hear now? The SJWs are telling us that violence against women and minorities in media will lead to violence against women and minorities in real life. Wow. There you go, Captain Obvious. It's not like we told you 20 years ago that there is this connection. But what it does show you is that those who were the liberals and now the socialists and SJWs who've come from them were never acting in good faith in the first place. They knew full well that violence in media could lead to violence in real life. They just chose for tactical reasons not to acknowledge that fact until they were in power to determine which group having violence directed against it was bad and which group having violence directed against it was good.
Well, exactly, and Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, was instrumental in getting labels put on music CDs, talking about explicit language, usually in reference to violence or profanity. And, she was mocked by many of these same types for doing that, and was, kind of called oppressive and, things like that. And I guess if the term had existed then, she probably would have been called a Karen for doing so. And the reality is that the former allies of many of these people are now saying the same thing, albeit they can't do it too often because certain conflicting groups glorify violence in their music. But yeah, that's these sort of things that were sort of like, well, duh, by the Christian rights standards, at least have been picked up by the left, and now they're using it for the same thing to justify it. Now, but going back to the just a broader idea, does the media that we consume affect us? I think that's probably one of the stupidest questions that could ever be asked, because we know, full well that what we consume on a regular basis does affect us, and not only does it affect us on I guess on a spiritual level, if you want to call it that, it affects us on a physical level as well. Probably one of the easiest examples to point to is the physical effects of pornography. When you engage in certain behaviors that are pleasurable, whether it's that or drugs or even the depictions of violence. There's some people that enjoy that to a sickening degree. But what you find pleasurable creates neural pathways in your brain that make your brain want to seek that time and time again to get that continual high. That's something that's not a question that has been demonstrated through science. And the fact is with porn especially, that's definitely the case. And it's gotten so bad with some men is that they can't even have an erection. And ED is common with porn addicts as young as in their 20s and 30s, far earlier than you would think. So these things are not just simply harmless or something to get your kicks off and expect no long-term result. The fact is, the media we consume may not defile us, to borrow from Jesus, but it certainly does affect us in the way that we're able to process certain things. And again, this is something that we've been able to prove, and we have seen the effects in real life. And so if these things are common and exposed, people are exposed to at a younger and younger age for things such as violence, things such as profanity, and pornography, it has very deleterious long-term effects when it comes to their development, and mentally and otherwise. And so again, even if we can't specifically point to a school shootings relationship to Call of Duty or whatever first-person shooters out there, I mean, we can't deny that at least on some level, what is consumed when it comes to media does have some level of effect on behavior. And this idea that somehow it doesn't, it's not only silly on its face. The data just doesn't back it up.
Well, exactly. And the corollary to this concern was the sexually explicit content in music, film, and cinema. And now, imagine my shock. We have Me Too. Almost like, wow, like no one could have seen that coming, Master Sanders.
None. And here's the thing. Uh, we were sort of promised, I guess you could argue this goes back to the early 20th century, that if we just discarded all these hangups that we have as human beings when it comes to sexuality, things that are considered, social impositions, interestingly enough, things like monogamy and heterosexuality being the norm and not allowing us to explore our true selves sexually. If we could just get rid of these hangups, human beings would be a lot better adjusted, and we'd live in a lot better world. Problem is with the door opened up by with these changes of sexual behavior, has led to actually far more angst over concerns of behavior. So, for example, rape. This has been said, and you can argue as to how right it is on a specific level. But I would argue that rape culture was in large part came out of the hookup culture. There was this idea like, yeah, man, you should be able to sleep with whomever you want to. and women were encouraged to engage in this sort of activity. And the problem is, and I don't think anybody one of us want to admit it, is that men and women approach sex from different with different understandings, different goals in mind, and because of that, that's why we behave differently. And when it comes to sex, that's why men seem to, at least most of the time, seem to have a rather detached approach to sex, and whereas women do not so. And with a lot of these women who have been encouraged to engage in this promiscuous behavior, it's affected them mentally to the point where if they don't like, to at least in my guess, if they don't want to take responsibility for their actions, they'll just scream rape to cover up for the fact that they know what they did was wrong and unnatural. So we have, in many ways, it was almost inevitable that some sort of form of Me Too would snap back. And again, while you would say that a lot of these people that have been caught up in Me Too really didn't deserve it, or at least it's not as egregious as the charges make it out to be. But at the same time, there was this sort of culture that encouraged uh, men to be rather crude in their assessments of women, and rather flirtatious and inappropriate ways that in many ways the new atheists wouldn't have had a problem with about 20 years ago. And that's why we're here today. In fact, that's why we had the split in the first place between the Atheism Plus, which became the SJWs, and the skeptics today. Was because one woman at a conference was propositioned by an older atheist. And that's why we're here today. So it's in many ways they're pushing the idea that we could discard traditional morality in the way that was upheld by the Christian right has blown back in our faces, and we may be forced to become "quote unquote" sexual Puritans again, thanks in large part to what the new atheists have done here.
Well, exactly. And to switch back over to the fedoras, with the rolling out of gay marriage. I think it was like 2006. There was that case in Tyler and in Texas, which overturned the remaining state objections to homosexual unions. The religious right claimed that this would be a slippery slope to incest and polygamy and pedophilia and all these other things. Was just laughed at. But now we have the transgender madness, which is directly correlated to the homosexual movement, which is directly correlated to everything that we were warning against. Now, granted, nobody thought we'd get to transgenderism. That was something that even the religious right in their worst nightmares couldn't envision, or anybody really. And also now we have normalization of bestiality. I think Vice has had people who like to have intercourse with insects. That's Vice for you. And then they also are trying to normalize pedophilia. There was the virtuous pedophile a while back. So why don't you unpack some of that, Master Sanders?
Well, I mean, there was, if going back as far as the 80s, there was when the prospect of greater gay rights was sort of being broached with AIDS. There was this fear among many people who were social conservatives, those on the religious right, that this would lead to a slippery slope to accept all sorts of other things. This idea of marriage equality is like a brilliant exercise in Orwellian, tactics when it comes to language. Gay marriage is an oxymoron in and of itself. Gay marriage throughout the history of the West, at the very least, and I believe in other cultures as well, was that it's between a man and a woman, or at least one man. One man and at least one woman. They could have like one woman, three women, five women, but nevertheless, you still have that heterosexual model led by a man. So with this with this idea that marriage can be redefined, opening the door to gay marriage, so you can have two men and be considered a married couple in the eyes of the law. That opened the door. At least that was the fear of the religious right. That would lead to other things as well. Lead to things such as pedophilia, bestiality. The fact that if marriage can only be limited between one man, can be redefined as opposed to one man and one woman. When's the limit? If there's no God, what's the limit? And we are still waiting to find what that limit is. While we haven't had any Supreme Court cases yet when it comes to other issues, we are seeing a gradual acceptance of greater and greater degeneracy. And for many years, when the religious right would bring up this objection, they were shouted down as having like, "Oh, that's slippery slope fallacy. That's just because you get X doesn't mean necessarily you'll slip down into Y." And the problem is that it already has, right? We have seen this play out, and even some of the skeptics have acknowledged this. I remember there's a comment section, I think, of one video that was from Bill Nye the Science Guy's Netflix show, which was a disaster, which basically demonstrated how he had sold out to the SJW elements of today. And one song they did that was incredibly cringy was called "My Sex Junk," right? And that sort of became a meme in and of itself. And the comment section was just full of former Fedora tippers that were saying, like, "Man, I wish I want to apologize to the Christian right. They were right all along when it comes to some of this stuff." And the fact that if the sky is the limit, pedophilia, as you mentioned, is being broached as being somewhat acceptable. Even if this kind of Catholic idea that, like, well, you may be attracted to them, but you're not acting on it, you're celibate. And the fact that we say here in our culture, love is love, then why can't we have a more normalized form of pedophilia if Pandora's box has already been opened in that area? So it's only a matter of time before we'll see this stuff, unless there's a huge cultural reversal when it comes to this issue. And transgenderism, obviously, but I even think polygamy and probably pretty soon bestiality will soon be put on the table as well.
Exactly. And as far as this slippery slope myth, because I don't even think the slippery slope is an informal fallacy at all. I was talking to one of my friends. He's been on here before, Logos, and he was mentioning that when he was talking to other people about this as well, they don't have a limiting factor. So once you allow the floodwaters to come in, there's no check, right? The mechanism doesn't have anything in place that will say the waters go this far and no higher. There is no check. And furthermore, it shows you the gross stupidity of the fedoras and the neckbeards and the social libertarians, because they weren't the ones making these decisions. The ones making these decisions were high up in media, in the courts, in the universities, and they should have been paying attention to what they were saying. Now, at least to his credit, David Horowitz has been sounding the alarm against Marxist professors for decades. But again, nobody listened to David either, just like nobody listened to Bill Lind. And, the reason why the religious right was right is it wasn't magic. We saw who was in charge. We saw who was running the universities. And again, as Bill Lind, one of the co-founders with Paul Weyrich, said, it was that these Marxists had taken over the institutions. And they had their own particular agenda that they were going to push onto all of us. But they couldn't go from, normal heterosexual monogamous relationships to transgenderism overnight. It had to take, 60 years, or rather, we should say more accurately, the last 30 years of a full court press of blood libel and propaganda against Christians.
Exactly. And this kind of goes back to a fundamental problem with the anti-theist solution, is that human beings can exist without a religion at all, however you define religion. And Marxism, and there's another thing that they mocked Christians too, was, when Christians would bring up that something worse would take its place if we removed God from schools, if we removed God from the public sphere, that something worse would take its place. And I think that's another form of informal fallacy where supposedly, if you remove X, you inevitably get Y. This idea that nature abhors a vacuum. Problem is that's a maxim for a reason. While it may not be provable always, it's something that tends to happen when we see it. So, for example, what you were saying is that I think an excellent example of this is popular culture. If you've followed a lot of what's funny is that the culture war was initially a term that was used in reference to Christians fighting against increasing secularization, such as Bill O'Reilly put it, the war on Christmas, removing references to God and prayer in public places. etc. And they were mocked by the atheists for this culture war mentality. Now, what's funny now is a lot of these same atheists are engaged in culture wars over something else that they take as a religion, and that is popular culture franchises owned by major corporations. So, if any of you have ever followed what's going on within, let's say, the Star Wars fandom, Star Wars, it's basically a religious war between two varying interpretations of what constitutes canon, interestingly enough, and what is Star Wars. And so, from this, the religious fervor that corporate properties have taken and have become religions in and of themselves, by the way that is demonstrated by the way how people are obsessed with them and will defend them to ludicrous lengths, has shown you that the removal of Christianity hasn't made us freer. The removal of Christianity hasn't made us free from objects of worship or modes of worship. We've just simply shifted them to man-made things. And so, whether it's Marxism or whether it's corporate franchises, we're still living, in a sense, in that vacuum that nature has filled with ersatz products.
Well, we could have also titled this episode Bonson and Rushdoony Were Right, because Bonson and Rushdoony pointed out that there's no such thing as neutrality in the public square. They said that the world we were living in, and they were writing in the 80s, was a secular theocracy. And it was true then, and it's true now. It's just that the fedoras thought they were on the winning side back then. But the secular theocracies moved a long way since the 1980s. And now we're beginning to realize that free speech, freedom of expression, all of these things, guilty until proven innocent, the most basic fundamental principles of Western English jurisprudence are gone. And they're gone because the secular theocracy took it away. And of course, when there was the autism wars against the religious right, what side were these people on? They were on the side of the secular theocracy. And now the secular theocracy is turned against them. I mean, to quote Ian Malcolm, I hate being right.
Well, and you have talked about this in the past, I think, also with Logos and others. One sort of pathetic attempt by the skeptics to beat back the SJWs was, of course, Sargon of Akkad's liberalistism, which didn't last. I don't even think it lasted a year. But liberalistism was essentially warmed over purportedly classical liberalism with none of the foundations that classical liberalism has. See, that's the joke, right? Liberalism, as we understand in the West, whether you like it or not, is rooted in some form of theism. When you read Locke or Loki, as the case may be, Locke draws upon this idea that man once existed in a state of nature because he was created in a state of nature. And so the whole idea that man has rights in the first place, transcendent of society, comes from a view of a God that created man that way in the first place. So that's why it says in the Declaration of Independence that all men were created equal and were endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. So, even our culture of liberty, which they claim that, the theocrats were going to take away and throw us back in the Middle Ages, are rooted in a form of theism or modified Protestantism, that the same ideas that they were trying to fight. And so whenever Sargon comes up with a list of things that he would, demand in terms of his ideal society or politics in liberalistism, it just comes off as sort of petty Christmas list, rather than drawing upon something that is transcendent, and that is God. If there is no God, if man's all there is, then man can truly set the agenda for whatever. The sky's the limit. And the only thing is that the SJWs have actually taken this to their logical conclusion, whereas the skeptics are still trying to figure that out, if they ever will figure it out.
Yeah, actually, this does tie nicely into the previous episode we did on theonomy. Whether you think that the Bible is the foundation of Western society or not, what the theonomists, and more broadly speaking, the religious right, were absolutely correct on is that absent some transcendent core, there is no point from which you can construct society and put a tide against tyranny. You know, the we've seen the fedoras flailing around for the last decade, like a wounded, seal, trying to fight this movement, and they've been singularly ineffective. And they've been ineffective because they're really the same kind of people. They have the same assumptions. They all believe that people are fundamentally equal regardless of race or sex. They all believe the same. They all watch the same, movies growing up, Star Wars, Back to the Future. They all have the basic same values. The only problem is they're happy where they're at, or they haven't gone far enough, or they think the SJWs are moving too fast. But otherwise, they can't be successful because they share the same basic assumptions. And that basic assumption is that man alone is able to determine what is right and wrong. Man alone. And well, if man alone can determine what's right and wrong, then that just means might makes right. And we're seeing that right now.
Well, exactly, exactly. And so it reminds me of something I saw from the Britisher, who is a part of the skeptic community. This was, I think, about a year or so ago, and he was, I don't remember the exact thing the thing was, but he was trying to bolster his more or less uh, skeptic credentials. While he was very critical of the left, he was also very critical of the right. More specifically, the moralist aspects of the right. And I don't remember the exact. It may have been about Chick-fil-A when they opened in Reading, or something to that effect. And he was He was saying that basically, uh, the cancel culture. That's before that was really a term at that time. But the cancel culture that was prevalent in the left was previously there in the right, and so he couldn't ally with the right either for that reason, and mocking them that somehow the Beatles were responsible for all of this. Because you got to keep in mind, in Britain they had similar cultural issues that we had here in the United States. People like Mary Whitehouse, who were trying to fight for greater standards in television, and probably most famous for her crusade against Doctor Who with some of the violence that she perceived was being excessive. But nevertheless, you can't really argue that a lot of the cultural problems that we have today, like that, were sort of symbolized by groups such as the Beatles and the Summer of Love in the 1960s and all these other things. That's led us to this path where we are now. And so, like, the dishonest, not the dishonesty, but just the lack of moral, the lack of ability for these people to actually grasp why we are here is why the skeptics will continue to fail in the culture wars. Because while they and the thing is, they have a track record of failure. Like, Ken Ham is still here, creationists are still here. People are, Americans are predominantly creationist in one form or another. Most Americans are some form of theist, even if they aren't devout. And today, they're the ones that are ultimately getting surpassed by people such as BreadTube in terms of their viewership. And again, they've not really done anything. And so within the skeptics, you've seen those like Sargon, those like Computing Forever have veered much more to the right, and then you have people like Armored Skeptic that have veered much more to the left. And it just shows you that there was no real substance in the center when it came to the skeptics. And so even they had to join one side or the other.
Well, the other thing that's interesting too is back in the 90s when they were fagging for the alphabet soup people and feminism, and they thought that homosexuals and women were their allies. Well, come 2020, they don't have any women and homosexuals. And furthermore, they're all white. So they're like the perfect target for woke anti-racism. And despite all of their efforts to argue that, these issues that they were fighting their religious right on, because they did that those other people would now view them as allies, was not true at all. In fact, they've now organized against them and have been routing them at every turn. They routed them on video games. They routed them on the movies. I mean, the Disney coup was, something that the religious right could only dream of.
Which is also funny, is because, during the time that Michael Eisner was president of Disney, you had people on the religious right that were seeing the rather scary direction that was being taken by Disney at the time. The fact that they were opening nightclubs at Disney World, the fact that they had Miramax as their label for their more edgier and adult-oriented content, and the fact that homosexuals were openly welcomed and courted to come to Disney World. These sort of things, which led to the Southern Baptist Convention's boycott of them, and they were mocked. They were mocked for it. And today, these same people and the skeptics they're raging against how Disney has taken that same kind of progressive agenda under Michael. Oh man, I forgot. Actually, I don't think that's his name. Is Bob Iger? That's it, Bob Iger. Who is, whether he's endorsed it or whether he's tacitly supported it, what have you. Even with the direction that Star Wars has taken, it shows you that that their alliance with these same people, as you said, it's done them in. And to be honest, it shows you like how stupid this whole thing is. They really didn't care about these issues until the SJWs went after their media. So like whenever Anita Sarkeesian went after grossly over-sexualized characters in video games, and the sort of denial that they weren't, or that it was just good fun. Like, anybody with two eyeballs can tell you that most of this stuff was meant to pander to more baser pleasures and things like that. That was obvious. But they only started to care about these things once they started going after their hobbies and their TV shows and their movies and their video games. And it just shows you like how skewed their priorities are, and just how petty a lot of this is.
Well, another thing, Master Sanders, is this idea that degeneracy and indulgence and hedonism would render one impotent, both literally and figuratively, is demonstrated by the current tepid resistance to the progressive movement itself. These fedoras are so impotent, they just roll over and die. It's like there just really isn't any real effort. I mean, when it came to social activism, the religious right used to have rallies. The religious right used to have marches. Well, where are the marches and rallies? The only person I've known who's done that is Sargon, and that was a flop.
Well, not only that, he tried that. I think Godwinson called it his sort of liberalist beer hall pooch, it's sort of like where they all just basically had to meet up. I mean, it was kind of pathetic, really, but it was just, they were, forgive me for language, they were just all basically sucking off Sargon. But once Sargon got out of that bubble, and he was actually met by SJW activists, throwing milkshakes at him, and some of his more reprehensible comments came to light, it absolutely it proved to be a disaster. And he took down what could have been a very good, he took down a viable political party with them. UKIP is dead for all intents and purposes because of his involvement with it. And the fact that UKIP tried to court some of these people. And the thing is, they destroy everything they touch. And that has been prevalent, as we've seen in the present. They can't even preserve the things that they fought the religious right on, because they've been successfully outflanked by, whether it's a good movement or not, at least a somewhat intellectually, maybe not consistent, but a little more robust and vehement ideology than they had.
Well, exactly. And when you look at this they destroy whatever they touch. I think this is slightly anachronistic, but only slightly. Let's look at fantasy, right? Fantasy was created by Christians for Christians, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings are world-renowned classics. I think in the England, the Lord of the Rings is rated the second greatest book after the Bible. Now, what have the fedoras done since they've taken over fantasy? They freaking run it into the ground. There isn't really fantasy to speak of at all. I mean, Game of Thrones. I mean, that's what they gave us, right? We had Middle Earth and Narnia, and now we have Game of Thrones. I mean, that really does just tell you what these people are all about.
Well, exactly. And the thing is like a lot of the complaints made about video games, about popular media, in terms of the sexualization of women, unrealistic standards and things like that. I mean, with fantasy, as you mentioned, it was a largely Christian genre or sub-Christian genre. And where do you get this over-sexualization of female characters in Narnia or in Lord of the Rings? In fact, in many ways, the opposite. Arwen is the sort of, you can exaggerate it, of course, but Arwen is almost as much of an admirable feminist character to a certain degree, more than any of the other ersatz ones that they make today. Could you imagine somebody like Arwen actually being made by somebody who's a new atheist? No. And so even then, like a lot of the tired tropes that you hear complaining about fantasy were not prevalent in the genre until it became much more of an atheistic one that you see today. And so again, they have laid the seeds for their own destruction this way by turning them into exercises in author appeal rather than trying to produce a good story.
Yeah, this really does the whole mentality of the mindset of the fedora reminds me of what Solomon wrote in Proverbs 1, verse 32. For the turning of the way of the simple will slay them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. And that really pretty much sums it all up. I mean, other than a giant pile of excrement over the last 30 years, what does the fedora, new atheist, libertarian, civil libertarian, anti-theist have to show for it? Absolutely nothing. And furthermore, they I think deep down knew that the religious right was right, especially about the power vacuum being filled by Marxists. Because I had stories even from my dad back in the 80s when the Soviet Union was still around, and he was in STEM. And so he would point out to these guys that, well, we already tried your experiment. It's called the Soviet Union, and it failed. Or, well, it hadn't failed yet, but it was really bad, and nobody wants to live there. And he, they would just freak out. And then, you bring it up in the 90s and the 2000s, and they'd be like, oh, no, we wouldn't have Marxism again. Well, we have Marxism again. Wow, who could have seen that coming?
Exactly. And the thing is, when it comes to the overall issues brought up by the religious right, the vacuum that was created by the absence of Christianity has just led to another form of authoritarianism, what they claim to have hated. In fact, they've gotten back what they've hated in spades. That's the morality police has arguably been worse under the SJWs than it has been any time whenever the Christian right has had an ability to actually exercise power in this regard. But I think with the skeptics, those that remain that still have this sort of juvenile vision that we can go back to the 90s at this time when everything was sort of, well, you could be edgy and you would be applauded for it, and that we were free from any kind of restraints or reduced restraints. The idea that we could somehow go back to that is just ridiculous. It's sort of like the reactionary who believes that if we go back to some form of pre-modern civilization, like feudalism, that we could undo a lot of the problems that communism created. Well, the problem is communism was a direct result, or a large part antagonized by the feudal structures and their incredible authoritarian and unjust practices. And so nowadays, it's the same thing. It's that the skeptics want to just go back to the time that created the conditions in which we are now. And so not only is that unrealistic, it's undesirable. And I think the skeptics will continue to lose until they realize this fact. And in many ways, they'll just have to abandon anti-theism if they're in their previous assumptions that they've held on to years, if they have any hope of beating back the Leviathan that is SJW progressivism.
Well, exactly. And I think one point to bring up that you would probably have something to say about is the closest thing to a country run by the religious right in the modern age would have been Northern Ireland. And pretty much none of the things they said would happen, none of the things that the fedoras predicted that religious right rule would happen, did happen.
I'm not as familiar as which point are you getting to with Northern Ireland?
Well, the point is that Northern Ireland was essentially a heavily Christian. A lot of the religious right influences were there, and it's one of the best parts of the UK to live in, contrary to the dystopia that was conjured up by the fedoras.
Well, I would say probably it's better placed than Scotland or even Wales at this point, because those places have become increasingly secularized, in large part because of the, I don't know, the more left wing environments that you see in Scotland and Wales. But even then, we don't even have to take a Christian example. Look at Singapore. Singapore is one of the wealthiest countries in the world per capita. It's a well-established port, for, basically the crossroads of the world go through Singapore. And the thing is, Singapore, there's plenty of things to criticize it for as well, but Singapore does have restrictions when it comes to pornography. In fact, they're notorious for it. Uh, and while it would be in a stretch to say that that is directly linked to the prosperity that Singapore has, nevertheless, Singapore is able to live in a very thriving, industrialized, cohesive society despite its religious and ethnic diversity. In large part because some of these more degenerate elements, I think, are curved. And so the thing is, when it comes to censorship of material that is degenerate and harmful to the development of the next generation, it goes back to, like, I want to live in a free society. I mean, the reason why I think you and I would oppose some of these things is that we want to live in a free society, because in order to live in a free society, you have to have a moral populace, and having free access to a lot of things that are degenerate and are intentional uh, in their desire to titillate and to uh, basically appeal to base desires. If we The desire to censor that is not just simply because you want to have more control, because in the end it's going to get censored one way or another. The thing is that because if we want to live in a free society at all with a moral and upright people that don't need to be regulated by an all-powerful, all-intrusive state, we would want some standards when it comes to the way to the media that's broadcast and consumed and celebrated. And nowadays we're going to, large part because of the degeneracy that we've experienced, we have much more mistrust in society. We have more individualism to an unhealthy degree, where the point where social bonds are no longer existent. And this stuff like this will invite greater and greater tyranny as the cycle continues. And so, if only for the reason why you want to live in a free society where you're not, trampled on by the state, you would want to have, on some level, whether it's formal or informal, censorship of degenerate materials.
Yeah, exactly. We're about out of time. Do you want to leave us with any final thoughts, Master Sanders?
Well, I would ask any skeptic, you know, is given the fact of everything that's happened over the past couple of years, is the society that we live in now any better? Right? Is the fact that Christianity is on the run from the public sphere? Is the fact that we have a class, if they're not ruling in legally, at least in influencing the next generation, that we have universities that are shaping our culture today in very disturbing ways. The fact that we're going to have authoritarianism in a far more uglier form, was the religious right telling you that that certain video game that you were playing, or that certain magazine you were reading, or that certain hobby that you were enjoying, were perhaps detrimental and perhaps dangerous to your well-being? Were they perhaps so wrong after all? Like, was your evangelical Jewish Catholic mother really that bad when she told you you couldn't play that game because of the skimpily clad women? I mean, was that okay? Would you rather have that, or would you rather have the society in which we currently live in which those things are going to get censored anyway, and more of your freedoms are going to be trampled on in the name of social justice?
Exactly. I mean, the only thing I'll end with is the religious lawyer was right. You can't have a degenerate society and be free. This is Todd Lewis of the Prez of Folly podcast, signing off.